And so welcome to the June 1st Food Processing Ontology Workgroup. And it's Trini and I presenting on how and why food processing or processes in general. And I will take control of the All right, so in this work, I was trying to tease apart the Obo founder process model and make a distinction between planned processes. This is in the realm of material processing, not data processing. But in the realm of material processing, doing processing by objective versus mechanism, and trying to tease apart a useful distinction there. So the distinction we came up with is that you can look at processes just by objective, and that's where success is determined by some testing of an output material to see if it meets some criteria, objective criteria. Or it can be a little bit more indirect. You can be using a formulation of process parameters to arrive at what you want. So the 3-minute egg. You can also have an objective just to use less resource in your process relative to some other process. But the main thing is that it always takes time to achieve an objective. So the process will undergo time. Now, mechanism is a little bit different. The objectives can be relative. So I can have a mixer that just mixes stuff, and it's slowly, relatively mixing the stuff more, but I haven't said when to turn it off. So that means there's no set end time, and you can be running that process forever. So that means no cutoff or change threshold to stop the process. So we were trying to dive into how people were using mechanism so far. And when you look at any particular process, it really takes some teasing apart. See whether it's by objective or by mechanism, which components are expressed in the plan specification. So looking here, material process by mechanism, we've got energy modulation, applying it or removing it. We've got force modulation, cutting, pressing, even centrifugation. Some of these processes can have two homes, so material separation as well. Centrifugation falls under that category. Fractionation, the combining of materials, that can actually be both objective and mechanism. Material containment, the ways of containing one thing inside another without necessarily affecting it, and molecular mechanism, which Trini will talk about. So all of this stuff can be studied at a macro and micro level, and Trini will dive into that part. I mentioned no process by mechanism term has an endpoint. The rate of application, though, is something that mechanism processes can talk about. They can consume power at a certain rate or mix at a certain speed. That's the main point there. So over in the process by objective, this really requires some kind of sensing, unless you're operating based on a formulation, but even the formulation requires some sensors to monitor. So we broke it down into the food processing by objectives, which we'll come back to later, but fractionation by objective and homogenization, and material processing by temperature threshold. So Troy, you have a question. And
thanks, Damien. You can push this question till later if it's more appropriate. I'm wondering how objective here is different from or similar to what we were calling output in other conversations?
Yeah, I'll circle back on that.
Great. That's fine.
Yeah, and it's about expressing, how do we express objectives, at least in the ontology world. So yes, they can often be expressed by defining the characteristics of the output you want in the process. Okay, so material processing by objective, and so we're seeing energy there on the temperature side, fractionization and homogenization in terms of mechanical stuff. And then the food processing by objective gets a little bit more subtle, because we can then be talking about sensory objective and health objective. We'll come back to that later. So, but at any rate, there are thresholds now that we talk about. So material characteristic change, taking a material to some temperature, and we have that set temperature in mind. So a process may take longer or shorter to get there and might consume more or less resources to do it. And that's the efficiency side of things. So of course, any process we might look at may actually have both these components. So there's material processing by objective, in this case, boiling example, where you're trying to take some liquid to a temperature threshold, and then the mechanism, in this case, heating of material by either conduction or radiation, and then there's various ways of doing that. So boiling in a stovetop is choosing one objective, but a different mechanism than boiling in a microwavable dish. So there's also the possibility that you're manipulating in your process the context of a material, not its inherent characteristics. And that gets us into the world of transportation and packaging. And the industrial ontology boundary has actually their own ontology and sort of a beta mode, and they actually mention material location change process as one of theirs. So we're kind of, I think we're going to be on the same wavelength. So this is just a little example of heating and boiling water in this new paradigm of breaking a process down, and let's see how we can describe this simple task. So we get the container, we get some water, we put the water in the container, and we apply some heat, and we wait until it's boiling, and then we might add stuff, and then keep on boiling to get back to the boiling point. So this is where we're getting back, Troy, to your thought about objectives and outputs. So we'll say that adding liquid to container is a process by objective, and it changes our graph, our knowledge graph, from a state where some liquid was not located in a container. We do this process, and now in the knowledge graph, we have the liquid or an instance of it, and it is located in some instance of a container. So the state change has happened between in the knowledge graph. And that's meaning that we could probably actually just say at a class level, adding liquid to container has specified some output liquid, and it's located in the container. So the objective is actually stated as the output material in its knowledge graph context. There's a little bit of tricky stuff here. I think I already talked about in the first presentation about needing to have identifiers connect instances of process stuff, inputs and outputs. We can't connect them directly, otherwise we have a logical contradiction in time. We can't have the liquid that's not located in a container and located in a container. Okay, so heating liquid. Similarly, we're going to take a look at how a process might represent that. Um, it looks like it's a process by mechanism. And the reason is we can start with some liquid located in a container and end up with liquid located in a container, but we haven't said what temperature that liquid has reached. But in this heating liquid in container, we are saying necessarily that there's some thermal energy as an input, and we need some device that's capable of this process and utilizing the energy, by the by. Yeah, Troy.
If I'm following right, Damien, what we've set up here is that there are two families of mechanisms or of actions. There's actions that have an objective, and that's their sort of central defining characteristic, and then there's actions that have a mechanism, and that's their defining characteristic. And I guess I'm just wondering why we made that duality. Why not have the verbs, the actions, potentially have objectives and potentially have mechanisms?
It can, yeah. And that's the multi-homing part. So a lot of these processes, we might only refer to them by their objectives, or we might only refer to them by their mechanism, but any one of those might have both, or they may not have both. So my mixer device, then I'm going to go mix, and I don't happen to have a time that I'm going to turn that off. I've just talked about that whole thing without an objective of time, just a relative objective of mixing. So there's this. So now why get into this? Because I'm looking for a process. If I'm looking for a process by objective to boil some water, how do I go and choose? What's the flexibility in choosing processes to get there? Well, I'm looking at the processes by mechanism to see they may all share the ability to get to the boiling water point, but I'm looking at their mechanism parts, see which ones are best suited. Do I have a microwave? That would be fastest, most energy resource efficient. Do you have a stove and a pot and all of that? So
I think I'm following you. But it seems to me here to be unnecessarily complex. So the process, the idea that you have process by mechanism implies there are processes by mechanism and processes not by mechanism. And it would seem to me that the cleaner way to do it would be there are activities, processes, and these optionally have a mechanism. And so the mechanism entity and the process or the activity entity are separate and they have a relationship. Instead of saying there are processes with mechanism and then there's like a twin process or the same thing which can be used again, which doesn't have a mechanism, it seems like you're sort of duplicating things and making unnecessary choices and complexity. Am I missing something?
Well, I'm treating in a sense is like a mind exercise. It's training the mind to look at my mind to look at any process and be easily able to recognize which parts of it are objectives, if any, and which are mechanism. And it's we can talk abstractly about processes and not mention mechanisms at all. And so it's this shifting territory between which paradigm that we need.
Let me build on that. So I think the way you're using the word process here, mechanism here, in my sort of plain English, would be actions we can do to a food, cutting, cooking, etc. Those are mechanisms. And process here is not an action. It is a combination of action and mechanism or action and objective or something else. Heating liquid in container is the example you've got here. That's a process in the perspective of this presentation. Is that right?
It is. I must admit, my own brain doesn't make a distinction between action and process.
Okay.
Maybe I can give a more complex example, like why there's a difference between objective and mechanism. So if the objective, like this is a very simple example, and I can understand if it's sort of confusing to you here, but the point of this simplicity was, yeah, I mean, giving a complex example here wouldn't make sense, but the reason this distinction came, we saw this was a good idea is when you look at outputs like you want food to have a level of acidity, then sort of the pH would be an objective. You're fermenting something until it reaches a certain pH. That pH could be achieved if you didn't say how you got that pH, it could be fermentation. Fermentation itself could be, lactic acid bacteria fermentation or other fermentation, or it could simply be adding something sour. So there, the mechanism would be, a sort of a reaction or, adding a component or something. So like the how and why, and the same thing for like making a certain food soft or, so all of those like reaching some product property would be an objective, and how you get there could be done in several different ways. Now, fermentation could have another objective. So if you say you're fermenting something, it would be like, are you fermenting for preservation? So there could be like just a mechanism just to say I'm fermenting something, doesn't tell you why you're doing it, at what point you will stop the fermentation activity. So that's sort of like when you really zoom out and see what is being done to products, how do we achieve certain objectives, that's really where the distinction came from. So in all of this, like, I mean, I'm sure like words like mechanism and action and task and all of these things can be sort of quite confusing. So, but which is not something I can speak to. So I'm only sort of speaking to this very like zoomed out objective and mechanism from the product processing perspective.
Let me, I'd like to come back to the idea of objective versus or compared to output. What is the difference? What do we think?
So there are, as far as I can tell, there are a couple of kinds of objective. One is relative and one is absolute. To take an example. And so when we talk about process by objective, we're using the absolute objective thing. So by mixing some stuff, there is a relative objective happening, which is that from the last moment to the current moment, things are a little bit more mixed. Then I know my mixing process is working. The absolute objective is that we're mixing this to a certain viscosity, and now we need a sensor of some kind to detect that. Sensor might be needed just to know if our basic mixing process is working anyway with relative goal. So that's talking about the objective at two different levels, I guess. Does that help? So
no,
mechanism still has some objective in it.
Well, Damien, I think I could have said the exact same story using the word output instead of objective. So outputs, the measurement of what I've got after I've done something could have various metrics, various scales, right? They could be absolute scales, they could be relative scales. In addition to the scale I use, how precise, relative or absolute, et cetera, I could look at that measurement, more mixed, more viscosity, what have you. I could look at that measurement as an intention, right? What I want, which I would call an objective, or I could look at it as a fact. It's what happened. Yeah. But these to me are very subtle differences. I think they are differences, right? An intention versus a result. But I would expect the intention to be a form of result. In other words, after I mix something, it will be more mixed. I may want it to be more mixed. I may actually have it more mixed. But the fact it is more mixed after the step is an output, yeah? And this could be an objective output. It could be a resulting output. It could be a forecasted output. It could be a mistaken output, and so forth. Yeah. I think that's the clear, I'm guessing, I'm proposing, it's the clear way to think about this, is to link this idea of objective as a subform of output.
Yeah, I realize that there can be different process objectives besides just what the output is. Reduction of consumption, consumables, reduction of energy, location requirements. You could say maybe from a knowledge graph perspective, those are all measuring other things besides strictly the output of the material output of the process itself. But I totally see your point, and I agree. Most of the time, much of the time, we can express the objectives of the process by naming more precisely what the output material is and its characteristics. And then we can go search for mechanisms that can get us there.
Yes, and I think you when you're talking about output just now, you're talking about the output material you just said, right? So the output of boiling water is water, right, in a boiling state. But there's also outputs like the temperature of the water is an output, right? It is a result. So output, I think, in the more general term, is all the stuff you've got and states and characteristics that result after an activity has happened. Metrics move, materials change, etc. Yeah.
Let's just go through more of the examples, and we'll get a feel for how we're probably on the same wavelength. But we just need a certain language to express what that is from an ontology perspective, the nuts and bolts. So yeah, heating water to boiling point, what you're talking about. So if we define boiling water as having this temperature quality and quantity in units Celsius, should that be 200 degrees? I'm always getting Fahrenheit confused. No, I guess it's 100. 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, right, 100. There are different ways of measuring this state, but the boiling water has like a formal definition. In fact, it has a formal definition at a certain atmospheric pressure, and other things have their own boiling points. And in fact, this kind of invites a return in the digital age to the SI international system of basic units for various things like the meter and the kilogram. So we could define digitally that boiling water is pure water at 1 atmosphere, and kind of have an equivalent digital representation of that in the library of standards. So this boiling water can be used as an objective to state it where you're headed with your process. And so starting with drinking water, heating liquid in container, and having boiling water as the stated output is a way of expressing that you want to heat some water to boiling point. And then the different ways of getting there, such as direct heating of the container. So putting this all together, if you're modularizing each of the objectives, adding liquid to container, hopefully they all plug it together like Lego blocks. You got one FoodOn or lab process called adding liquid to container, another one heating liquid in container and boiling in container. So that's the future I'm looking forward to, one where we can have these things and a little bit of software and a recipe engine or something to pop each of them together and know every single little way that the things have to be identified through time, and what kind of resources are required as a result of calling into play each of these little process bits. So this now just gets us, so far, everything we've talked about isn't specific to food. It's laboratory processes, and OBI, the Ontology for Biological Investigations, is aware of this and is willing, or ventured at least an interest in taking their material processing branch and adding these various kinds of process mechanisms. But we'll have a debate there, just as we are here, about what's a good way of expressing it. So now we're getting into this organoleptic quality stuff, and I think I can probably hand it over to Tarini to start working some of these examples. But Ali, you have a question?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering if there should be a distinction between for me it goes to a lot of like the tools and the machines used for different processing. If there whether there should be a difference between planned processing for the function of that object, that machine, or that artifact, let's just say, versus the planned processes that happen through a disposition that mechanism or that machine has.
Mhm. And that's, if I'm not mistaken, that's sort of getting at the creative reuse of machines for other purposes, because they may have a disposition to do something, but they don't.
I mean, that's one part of it. The other part of it, I was thinking maybe like, oh, I don't know, maybe some machine that just is used to smoke meat, for example. It's, of course it has a certain function and there's a process that happens because of the function that it has, but at the same time it changes the color of the meat, which is another process that the meat goes through, but it's not due to it's not it's just some disposition that happens to gain, like the meat gains because of the process that it's going through. It's not the function of the machine to change the color.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I'm making sense over here. But I was wondering whether there should be a difference between those two.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that does that. So there's side effects is the word that comes to mind.
I mean, but that's the thing. Side effects are not necessarily planned. These things are planned. What I'm thinking.
Okay.
You know that you're aware of the fact that there's going to be a disposition
Okay.
gained by your meat, and you're not it's still planned for it.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah, right. So naming that, how to name the, I guess, outputs of a process that are arise from disposition rather than just functional design of the device.
yes.
Okay. Yep, that sounds it would be great to have a little bit more concrete examples of that so that we could create a pattern of
It just came from my own. So yeah, I definitely.
Okay, good. Okay, so Tarini, is this a good time to jump over to your stuff, or
Yeah, let's do that.
should I advance slide?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay, so this is just here to start getting an idea of what sensing is, because there's a use case of a very simple use case of cooking rice, and there these sensing decisions are made based on what is being sensed and how it's being sensed. So just very briefly, to achieve some sensory objectives, you need a sensing a device that does some sensing. And there are two main ways of doing this: sensing by an instrument or sensing by a human. And I mean, sensing by a human always happens at the end when you're eating something. Then you're sensing for aroma and mouthfeel, the color, the sound, all sorts of things. But you could also be, when a person is cooking, they could be sort of touching something for softness or visually observing for change of color, things like that. And sensing by an instrument, a very simple example is if you're, kind of grilling some sort of meat, then you might have a thermometer that's telling you when it's like medium rare and when it's well done and things like that. So the two basic ways of sensing, which tell you whether you've reached an objective, is an instrument or a human. Next slide, Damien. Okay, so this is the same sort of ontology. The how and the why also applies when you're looking at the molecular level of information. Right, so the reason we did this is because when you're studying the transformation of a food, it's done at two levels. At the molecular level, it goes down into whether a reaction is happening or a protein is being denatured. So you're basically talking about, has the composition of something changed? Or if you're talking about denaturing, then has the structure changed? And that's what you're basically measuring. And at the macro level, you would measure a bulk physical property, which is like the temperature. So for example, in a certain mixture, as water is boiling, you're going to measure the temperature is sort of the temperature in bulk, but it's possible that at some point, like closer to the container, and you know, this particularly happens when you're microwaving, for instance, where the temperature is different throughout the substance. But basically at a macro level, so not considering those exceptional states, but generally at the macro level, you're measuring a bulk physical property. So some of the questions here were like, you know, when we get into this molecular property, a molecular level distinctions, and what are some of the questions? And so the first one is that at this level, is there still a mechanism and objective? And yes, there is. And can we relate the macro and the molecular levels? So here's a sort of a very simple example. At a molecular level, you would talk about, when you're talking about a Maillard reaction, it actually is several different reactions. And, or like really high level, you would say give a kind of browning appearance or a browning aroma. Okay, next, Damien. Okay, so first the mechanism. There's two main ways, two main subclasses for this. One is what reaction is happening? Is it a covalent reaction? In a covalent reaction, what you start out with, the input molecules and the output molecules are different. Because there's like a change in you know, atomic bonds that's happening. So an example of a covalent reaction is a Maillard reaction, where you start with a sugar and an amino acid, and then those get consumed, and then you end up with other molecules. Non-covalent is like a very simple example is if something is hydrophobic or hydrophilic, which means it dissolves in water, stays separate from water. So this is happening because of like different sort of interactive forces of attraction and repulsion and stuff. And here the molecules are not changing. So these are non-covalent reactions. And then it's like where it is happening, if it's localized and then happening at certain surfaces, or it's happening throughout the material. Okay, next, Damien.
And I'll just say, it's been a learning experience for me to understand in food science, viewing the stuff at these two different levels.
So we took a case study, a cooking of rice, and here we talk about like why, like what benefit do you get by studying this macro and this micro level. So some of the aims that you will see as we walk through the next slides is, can you go back to this slide?
Oh.
Yeah, is how you use sensors to monitor the process at the different levels, the micro and the macro, relating these levels. And the other reason to do this is home cooking and scientific experiments. So for instance, if you had like a scientific, how do you sort of, you know, relate a scientific experiment? So if you had a sort of, you know, like a controlled protocol, then how does that vary in a home cooking situation where, of course, you've got, you know, like in a scientific, you've got much finer levels of control. So there's more granularity, and at the home cooking, there's less granularity. So is there like a parallel? So yeah, we'll go through these aspects. Right. So yeah, here kind of in this figure, there's a lot of stuff going on, but I'm going to sort of draw your attention to sensing. So how do you sense for process status, like where's the process at, or has the process reached completion? So here the example of rice is a bit taken because in rice, starch is the majority constituent, and most of what happens when you cook rice is a reaction on starch. And a major portion of that starch reaction is gelatinization. So so that's a little bit of background about rice. Anyway, so from a molecular perspective, gelatinization is the most important mechanism, and you can measure this through various instruments. Here we use and next slides, the instrument that's referred to is a rapid viscoanalyzer. And then at the end, or even at intermediate states, a human would check for the texture of the rice by, perhaps sort of pinching it between your fingers or something. So that's a human sensor.
Next slide.
Yeah, does anyone need another moment? Because there's a lot of stuff happening in this slide. So like any questions or anything I should talk about? Okay. So next.
Oh, sorry.
Right. So here you see the reason for the focus on starch is that it's the majority component in rice. And so when you heat the rice, there are changes to the starch polymer. I mean, there could be other sort of reactions, probably not a Maillard reaction. But so generally and this is what the molecular mechanism is getting into as you go into more detailed subclasses. Essentially, when you supply heat, then the starch molecule, which is sort of really tangled, is sort of, unentangling. So the molecular conformation is changing. So conformation of starch. And when you cook starch, so you see sort of a bifurcation there, there's a starch granule breakdown. So the starch is really packed together in a granule structure, or it's also called a starch crystal. And the process of gelatinization is this crystal. It takes heat, and because of the heat, because the increase in entropy, the starch granules start to, the force that holds them together, the heat that's being supplied is greater than the force that holds them together. And that's how they start. They lose the crystal structure. So that's just gelatinization of rice. Now, this can be measured quite precisely through instruments. So you see, so that's sort of the molecular scale, and after the rice is cooked, basically it recrystallizes. So that's explaining what happens at the molecular scale. Now, the macro scale, it is sort of, that's the sort of the human actions in a kitchen. It would be, perhaps soaking the rice before or cooking it directly, but then applying heat to it, and then you have cooked rice. And the cooked rice, you see, it is what you're measuring for is, softness or al dente, which applies here to rice, but it could be other texture properties for other different foods. And then there's the cooling process of rice, which we could sort of see as cooling. You might also be able to see it if it's something else that's starchy, like oatmeal or something. You might see a sort of separation of the liquid or something like that. It's essentially, in molecular terms, it's essentially the starch molecules recrystallizing. So to be able to measure the progression, it is much more detailed at the molecular resolution. Yeah, gelatinization could be an objective. It is, yeah, I think like that's where it's actually quite interesting that there are these words in food science that are used where gelatinization is an objective and it's also a mechanism. So that's actually been some of the very interesting parts. Like you could say, I want diced carrots, where, dicing would be the mechanism, and diced at the same time, diced carrots is an objective. So that was sort of the, but, gelatinization, we could get into this later. So it's
how do you measure gelatinization, and then when do you call it actually gelatinized enough for whatever purpose? So that's the difference between a relative process, the mechanism, relative gelatinization versus some absolute threshold of acceptability.
Yeah, also I think that these things from a molecular perspective, they're not really they're not visible. So yeah, you would need an instrument to measure.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'll note about this diagram is so we have rice soaking, heating of rice in water, cooling of cooked rice, and those are, from our perspective, all process by mechanism, because we haven't said exactly how much each of these, what these things should produce, but we did sort of overlay, or in this, we overlaid this soaked rice, this cooked hot rice, and this edible rice. Now, those are actually entities that do have some kind of criterion in them that make them look like outputs of a process by objective. So I guess if we'd wanted to be a little bit more subtle about it, we could have said we could have said that rice and water was still an output of rice soaking, and heating of rice and water, well, rice and water was still an output of that. And then cooling of cooked rice, actually that has an input of a cooked rice. And so that is kind of requiring a prerequisite objective. So it could tweak this diagram a little bit better, just to be a little bit more impartial about what the states of the things were that these processes had. And then we could overlay the objective entities, such as edible rice, cooked hot rice, soaked rice, which say that you've reached a certain point that's acceptable.
Actually, also to Michael's point, it is true. As you get down to like the real, like the lower classes, at some point it does become multi-homed. So gelatinized rice, but gelatinization basically means like a breakdown of the crystal structure. It's possible you could do that through an enzymatic treatment as well. So at the lowest level, yes, gelatinization is an output, but the way you get there could be different. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this was, so of course, you know, it's very interesting to just sort of start teasing apart the different subclasses. That itself is a really interesting exercise. But there was another reason for doing this, is when you are able to, you know, break something down, a very complex component into various like resolutions, then it can give, then it has opportunities for data modeling, for process control. And so simultaneously, I was also working on an application. So firstly, you need a language to be able to get, you know, you could also have experiments where you're collecting the data. But of course, as you know, as Chris was talking about yesterday, that if you want to basically get something from information from literature and then structure it, you need a vocabulary. And all of the vocabulary related to food processing is very complex. And you know, when you sort of read an experimental protocol, and also when you read, you know, the results from some food processing literature, they tend to talk about observations at the macro level and at the molecular level, and sometimes these are equivalent. And so this was a reason to really get into the nitty-gritties of what is this equivalence. If an observation is described, and when you want to merge into these large data sets, like how do you know that softness, which is measured by a human sensor or a texture analyzer, is the same as, you know, some other sensor which is measuring a molecular property. So this can be like very confusing. And when you're later using this data set to do some sort of a modeling, these distinctions need to be clear so that, you know, you really know what data to select for whatever kind of model that you're building. And so I did a little example of this. I got data actually on rice cooking, and I'll be happy to present these results. They're actually quite good. So the idea is to predict the objectives, and the reason for the reason to do this is that it sort of reduces this experimental load. That at a certain point, when you've got like a large enough body of data, then the predictive models can, you know, substitute for, you know, taking actual sort of, you know, kind of doing what if and various like scenario analysis. So what in my study, I tried to predict objectives, which is meaning here what the sensor would measure. And the first model used the structure of starch. So basically this phenomena of how the crystal structure breaks down and such, to predict the viscosity, and then use the viscosity to predict the product properties. Is it going to be hard? Is it going to be sticky? Is it going to be elastic? And so on. The other reason, when you have AI models, then you could start doing process control, dynamic process control. And this basically means that you have a sensor value and then you have a predictive model. So like you might want to take a decision that at this sensor value, if I continue, whatever heating or cooking, then I'll have this output. So that sensor value is a decision point where you can then sort of change whatever energy source or whatever input it is to the mechanism. And the other application that comes out of this is that you have integrated approaches of when you're exploring some food processing situation of like experiments and AI models. So of course, for this, AI models need to reach a reliability that you can use it to simulate, but it's definitely possible. So to get to this, you need enough data, you need a vocabulary to get the data. I think, yeah, that was it. So yeah, I'm happy to present this. I have good reliability. It's actually really interesting. And it definitely has like applications in food engineering.
Get Trini to do a monthly JFOW presentation on that in a month or two. Okay, so see a few comments and questions on the side. Yeah, Magali.
Hi, thank you both for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I've already learned much and read your paper. But I just wondering if you want to predict the property or to control the process, just as you mentioned, you have to have a sensor value, but I don't see this measurement on the diagram you have shown for gelatinization, for example, but because to assume that you have a gelatinization, either you have to measure it directly, as you mentioned, on the molecular scale, or you have to follow a time temperature diagram to achieve the right state of to have the right condition to have the gelatinization, So I was just wondering if you are just omitting the measurement for clarity, for clarity purpose, for simplification, or do you intend to add that also?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like there was far too much detail to add it all in this diagram. So of course it had to be like simplified. And also, this one here is the progress of the gelatinization process. So, gradually as the starch molecules get more energy, the conformation starts changing. And you can measure this not just with like, an RVA instrument, but you can use, for instance, some sort of infrared, some sort of a spectral method to also measure it. So again, it's sort of incomplete, right? In terms of like, how do you monitor this process of gelatinization? So multiple instruments can do that. And so of course, this diagram is very much simplified.
There's, I didn't even know it, but there's this has intermediate RO relation that allows you to connect some material to some process. And I think that's sort of the ticket to attach in a modeling perspective, to attach things that you're sensing during the process without elaborating on what all the little subpart processes are that are actually manipulating that thing. But it is a challenge to see if this is doing a good job of macro and molecular scale description, because we're trying to say that these are parallel processes. The sensing world is doing its sensing stuff, and then that's in parallel. Magali, you know all about this with PO too. It's parallel with an explanation of what's going on.
That's why I was mentioning time and temperature, because I think it is measured at the macro scale, versus what Tarini said, you have different ways of measuring gelatinization, but it is a analytical measurement, isospectrometric, as you mentioned. I think in the process you have to in modeling food science you have time temperature diagrams and so on, and or time pressure. So I think it could be added to the instance level, but
we did actually. We had so many versions, like it's so much information. We did have like a temperature indication earlier, and we kind of took that out. But yeah, it's what you're saying is true. It's a lot of information.
It's because of the dynamic. Yes, of the yes, it's quite complicated. I know.
I can see your point, though, that it would probably appease folks who are looking for a time perspective to have it explicitly stated that all these measures are happening at some time t, and that can vary. It's not just a one-off measure.
Well, and it could be at time t with device D in location L with data point D. I mean, there's all these things which some people may want sometimes, right?
So maybe what that merits is actually just a separate slide about what a measure or observation. We could change the language, peak viscosity observation. I usually associate observation with having all of those different things. A measure might be just a particular number, but as in PO2, an observation has a time. And I mean, this model, anytime you look at any data set, it's maybe missing some pieces. They forgot to mention what the device was. They forgot to mention when the time was measured or who measured it, and or where. But all of those pieces could be just part of an abstract observation model that you have all the parts of or not.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, like this paper, like we also had to think about like when we sort of made all these figures, came up with all these different figures and illustrations, like, well, what was this paper about? So it was about, like the breadth and the depth of the process hierarchy, the how, the why, how deep you go, the resolutions, the macro, the molecular. Can you use this vocabulary for home experiments and scientific experiments? Is there an analog between them? What are the sensors? So those were the sort of questions that we were addressing. So, I mean, the figures had to, at the very least, clarify those points. So, I mean, of course, there was a certain point of making a decision about how much information should this figure have, and what do we need what were the central questions in our paper. So, yeah.
Okay, so Kai, yes, it's sort of news to me, but I did pitch this to OB, not all of this, but just the notion of a process by mechanism branch, and they were totally into taking on all this stuff, especially because it's laboratory related. So that would be a consolidation of laboratory terminology in OboFoundry. At the moment, you have to go to allotrope or Exact2, these older ontologies, to try to find terms for boiling.
And just one more quick thing, Kyle, before you jump off. When we were speaking with Kyle about, they were sort of, they wanted to know whether in experimental foods, they should start like modeling processes. And one of the things Kyle had mentioned then is, what if they do their process in a certain way and a user cooks differently at home, then their process is not indicative of all the variations of the process.
Yeah.
And
no, we should talk about.
And that was one reason for this parallel. Yeah, like what do you do in that situation? Yeah. Yeah,
for sure. No, so at USDA, we got this checklist project, which is going to be the main integration framework for Experimental Foods Foundation and et cetera moving forward. And this is something that we're hoping to be able to leverage if FoodOn can put this out somewhere. So we can talk about that more later, Tarini. I got to go.
Okay. Yeah, I got to go too. Much as I'd love to stay and talk about this for hours. Thanks, Tarini, for your wonderful effort in making that paper go somewhere, food science related. And thank you all for your input. And Troy, ongoing dialogue. Maybe what we need to do is define words like action better, see what parts they have with respect to this.
Yes, Damien, I think that's exactly the intention of our next get together in this group, is to make these so-called high-level, classes or entities, blending together the good thought here, the good thought from Magali, and elsewhere.
Right. Perfect segue. Okay. Thanks all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.